Pleasant.
Thank you, Dirk, and thank you to PK for inviting me. New York is always a welcoming city to be at. And George, thank you for setting this up perfectly. And I'm going to tell you a little bit of how we've tried to look at this critically at Baylor and Houston, and we're moving forward with some stuff that we're going to show you guys soon and will be published regarding the way we've been seeing these patients. I will take a couple of seconds to say that I am part of a company that was built a few years ago that has been trying to understand some technology that might help us better and further understand this. George said it best, you know, these collaterals make a lot of sense. Back in the days, they were called the choke vessels, and there is adaptability to the choke vessels because they actually can perfuse in any direction. It's just a matter of hydraulics. Single tibial revascularization does have an effect on geography of the foot. And this has been really nicely put in this small little paper where you could see on an anterior tibial intervention how there's always increase of the perfusion only on the anterior part of the foot. The same happens when you do the PT angioplasty, then only the plantar aspect of the foot may have microcirculations. Now that's been also translated clinically where we have bypasses that are all fairly open, but still the heel may remain underperfused. Now, Azuma looked at this and decided to say that there was no influence whatsoever on indirect or direct. But he did say that in his cohort, all renal failure patients did have a significant effect on either direct or indirect revascularization. So our thought was, about a year or two ago, we say, well, we think that there's under-recognition of a subgroup of highly complex diabetic patients that suffer from erratic flow patterns secondary to small vessel disease or small collateral vessel disease. And when you look at what TASC says, the only performance goals that we have as operators on the table is get one vessel down to the foot. Well, that seems very ridiculous as we tend to understand the complexities of the foot. Our Asian counterparts, I think, are way ahead of the game. They've done their due diligence, and they're looking at pedal anatomy. They're looking at how the distribution of flow patterns affect and how wound blush affects healing. And in very simple papers, they've shown that when you actually get the pedal anatomy in the book and you have wound blush positive, your healing rates can become better. Now, this is very interesting extract from this paper where it says that percutaneously revascularized infrapopliteal artery is poor and more limited than after bypass surgery. And several treatment strategies have been proposed to overcome the limited blood flow after endo. For example, multi-vessel infra-below-the-knee disease. We don't necessarily think that is correct. We actually think that what you have to be is a little bit more of a sniper. You have to be a drone. You have to get the blood where it has to go. So rather than talking about angiosomes, I did steal somehow this from John Runback. He called it the angiographosome. And we've changed it a little bit and say, why don't we look at it from the other perspective? Look at it as the podiatrist trying to heal this. Look at the wound and what the wound angiosome and how can you get flow to the wound independently of how you go about it. So this just shows you a wound that has a very nice wound flow and an angiosome and a woundosome well perfused. But look at this heel ulcer where you would think that the posterior tibial should be the vessel that you should treat. Well, sometimes a 40 centimeter CTO is not straightforward. So we could go through the pedal circulation, we could get a wire in the right direction, and we could actually do angioplasty of the pedal loop, creating then retroperfusion of the heel from the anterior tibial angiosome. So don't necessarily go through the posterior tibial angiosome, but certainly create a woundosome that's perfused. This is another case where this is a bypass distally down to the posterior tibial, and you have an occlusion of the PT, and then over collaterals it goes actually into the forefoot. So very complex from the surgical standpoint with a really good bypass, but insufficient blood flow. And in this case, the retrograde axis of that plantar artery allowed us to then place a small little wire that was then further supplanted by a micro sheath. And you could see now all the pedal anatomy was actually intact, but you couldn't actually see it. At that point, retrograde axis was allowed to then cross slowly with a wire. And once we attained the wire passage, we were able to then secure it and do a through and through, and then with balloon angioplasty from above and below, have an adequate target. You've seen this before in multiple presentations, so you can just recapture the wire. And then in this particular case, we did laser atherectomy and then further did balloon angioplasty all the way down to the lateral plantar. And look at the beautiful wound blush that we accomplished. So in this particular case, the woundosome was ischemic. And at the end of the procedure, we were able to get the wound there. So the question becomes is how can we as operators become a little bit less blinded when we're trying to do these interventions? How could you tell that maybe a CTO of the POP is enough if your collateral pathways are good? Or maybe your collateral pathways are insufficient and you need a little bit more. So this is a paper that we put back a few years ago, and we've now started the Omnia study, which is a European study, already recruiting patients in Austria and Germany. And the interesting thing is this is a micro-oxygen sensor. It's a polyhexa particle that responds very interestingly to oxygen, and it gives you pretty much a micromole content of oxygen live through a stream of wherever you put the sensors. So in this study, it was really a first in man. We did it back in Costa Rica, which is where I'm originally from. But you could see how interesting the sensors placed in different areas of the foot will then respond very instantly, plus minus 4 seconds, to a revascularization procedure that you're doing. So once the balloon goes up or the balloon goes down, you have an immediate uptake of oxygen and the oxygen concentration, and then you see the trend for it to go better. When we did a lot of the initial background on healthy individuals, we found that this was a very interesting physiologic response. So you have your micromoles of oxygen here. Once you get a healthy individual and you leg raise them to about 30 or 45 degrees, their micromoles immediately drops down, but then there's an automatic physiologic compensation and it starts going up immediately. And then it recovers as you put the leg horizontally on the table. Again, immediate. Now let me show what happens with a PAD patient. Look at the top left, again, as your control subject. This is what a healthy individual would do. Now this is a guy that has a wound 1, foot infection 2, and ischemia, this is right, ischemia 3. In this patient with really low pressures, once you raise the leg, there's a drop and then there's no recovery of their micro-oxygen content. But when this patient was treated and when this patient was revascularized, and you could see the change in the DP pressures and the PT pressures, then look at when you raise the leg, and that's the blue line, there's the immediate drop, but then there's an immediate compensation. So we're seeing patterns of compensation, and we're seeing changes in physiology that we had never had eyes to be able to see. Now, the Omnia study is very immature. I would love to share some of the initial data, but we're really slowly enrolling. We're up to 10 patients right now, so it's going to be something very interesting for the next few months and or years to see. And with the last 1 minute, I would just like to extend an invite. If there's anybody there, medical students, fellows, researchers, or international physicians that want to come to Baylor College of Medicine and study this phenomenon with us, we have international opportunities. And we're always welcoming people to come and join our team. Thank you very much.